What is going on, chess YouTube? So in today's video, in honor of Gukesh taking the lead in the 2024 World Chess Championship match, we are looking at a crazy game where Gukesh absolutely smokes Vladimir Kramnik. This one is Vladimir Kramnik versus Gukesh D from the 2023 Everything's Masters Play-In Tournament. And here we go. In the game, Vladimir Kramnik is playing as white. He opens 1c4, the English opening, and Gukesh does go 1c5, the symmetrical English. Now we have g3, g6, bishop g2, bishop g7, knight c3, and knight c6. So far in this game, Gukesh is playing the copycat variation, literally copying every move of white. Alright, on move 5, Vladimir does go d3. This move is a favorite of Magnus Carlsen. When Magnus plays this, he does like to go queen d2, then b3, and bishop b2, fianchettoing his dark squared bishop on the long diagonal. Now, instead, in the game, Gukesh does go knight f6, not copying Vladimir, and now Vladimir does go a3, intending a very fast b4, expanding on the queen side and deviating from Magnus Carlsen's favorite way to play, again being queen d2, b3, and bishop b2. Now, Gukesh, how does he want to proceed? In the game, he does just castle, nothing wrong with that, short castles on the board, and now Vladimir. He continues with his plan of expanding on the queen side. He does go rook b1, getting the rook onto the soon-to-be, maybe open b file, and he is intending b4, gaining space on the queen side. Alright, this is a very critical point in the game. Gukesh, he's got to find the right way to respond to Vladimir's developing strategy here of simply b4, gaining space on the queen side and pressuring that weak pawn on c5. Now, what options does Gukesh have? Well, first of all, going d5 would be a blunder. Normally, that is a very playable move in the English. However, here, because white has not gone knight to f3, that means the bishop on g2 is still covering d5. That would obviously lose a pawn on the spot, so that is no good. Instead, Gukesh can go either a5, gaining space on the queen side and clamping down on that future b4 break, or he can go e6, intending d5, with that pawn being supported by the e6 pawn. Now, in the game, he does go for the latter option. That is the move e6, again, intending d5 on the next move, perhaps. Now, Vladimir, I expected b4 here. That is basically the entire point of his whole setup so far, but he doesn't do that. Now, instead of going, say, knight f3, that might be the strongest move here. He actually goes for the alpha 0 advance. That is the move h4. So Vladimir playing very cheeky chess so far in this game. And while I'm normally a fan of the alpha 0 h-pawn marching down the board in virtually any position, I'm not so sure what Vladimir is doing here. After all, h5 is covered by the knight, and Gukesh will be doing just fine. Now, here, in this position, Gukesh, he has the option of going d5 immediately. However, instead, it goes h6, and this is a very strong move. The point being, if Vladimir does go h5, then instead of taking the pawn, you can just go g5, blocking down the king side. Now, the problem with, say, h5, then knight takes h5, is white can go g4, trying to open up the g-file for his rook. That could get very dicey very fast, as after the knight moves, that pawn on h6 would be hanging, as both the bishop and the rook would be targeting it. Now, of course, h6 played in the game, and now Vladimir. What's he going to do? Well, the strongest move here is either bishop d2 or e3, intending queen d2 or c1, again, piling up on that pawn on h6. But instead, Vladimir, he's in a very disrespectful move. He does go h5, ignoring the idea of Gukesh, and he just wants to go g5 here. So, g5 on the board, the best move by far. And now Vladimir, it's only move 9, and as white, he's already significantly worse out of the opening, as he really doesn't have any good way to attack on the king side. And beyond that, Gukesh, again, he's just going to go d5, and he will have the better central control. And beyond that, his king's already castled, and if Vladimir ever goes, say, knight f3 and short castles, that pawn on h5 would hang to the knight. So Vladimir, he's in quite a bit of trouble here. How should he continue? Well, if you develop the knight, say knight f3 or h3, you will be in a lot of trouble. So with that in mind here, Vladimir, he does go for active operations on the king side immediately, and he does play the move f4. Now, this is the strongest move here. The point being, first of all, you are threatening f takes g5, then bishop takes after h takes, winning a pawn on the spot. Beyond that, of course, Gukesh, if he takes on f4, then bishop takes would be a good response, and you can follow up, say, queen d2 and so on, pressuring the king side. So not a bad idea at all. Vladimir is trying to make something of his slightly dubious opening, but here Gukesh, he is on his A game, and he just takes on f4. G takes f4 is the move, And now, of course, you can take on f4 immediately, but that would be a slightly dubious move. Then d5 by Gukesh would be extremely strong. Now, before taking on f4, here Vladimir, to his credit, he does find the strongest move in this position. That is the move bishop takes c6, giving up his Catalan-style bishop for that knight on c6. And the idea is he does want to damage black's pawn structure on the queen side and stop the idea of d5 with that knight being blocked by that pawn on d5. Now, of course, Gukesh, he can recapture the d pawn or the b pawn. Now, in this position, the computer likes the idea of b takes c6 followed by d5. However, personally, I'm not a big fan of that move, and I quite like the idea played by Gukesh in the game instead. That is the move d takes c6. Now, this pawn recapture does capture away from the center. Typically, you do want to capture towards the center, especially if you are a beginner. That is normally the right move. However, d takes c6 does have its ideas here. Specifically, that queen now has access to d4, and we may see something like queen d4 and knight to g4 pressuring f2 in the very near future. Now here, Vladimir, he does take on f4, but not with the bishop. He actually goes g takes f4 instead of bishop takes, recapturing towards the center with the pawn, but this is a very, controversial move, leaving that bishop on c1 undeveloped. And now Gukesh, he simply jumps in with the knight to g4, jumping down. Now the threat again, potentially queen d4, then queen to f2. Things are getting very dangerous very fast. Now here, Vladimir, he finds the best response, e4, opening up the attack on the knight on g4 with the queen. How is Gukesh going to defend? Well, he simply goes f5, defending the knight with the pawn. Very good. Now, of course, if white takes on f5, e takes f5 back is perfectly fine for black. And again, the knight stays defended. Now, Vladimir, instead of opening up the game, of course, his king on e1 is naked. It's like my dad's favorite TV show, Naked and Afraid. It's got nowhere to go right now. So with that in mind, Vladimir, he does try to keep the center closed. He goes e5, blocking the center, but now Gukesh, he flies in with the queen d4, threatening queen to f2 checkmate, the audacity of the Indian superstar. All right, Vladimir, how's he going to respond? Well, he's got to find some way to defend here. His options are 1, knight to h3, defending f2 with the knight. You can also go knight g to e2 or knight c to e2. The point being, after either knight move, after queen f2, the king can go to d2, as of course the queen, its access on the second rank is being blocked by either knight. Now, if you are going to do that route, it is very important to choose the correct knight to move. Now, the right knight to move is the g knight. Knight g to e2 is the right move, intending queen f2, then king d2. Instead, good old Vladimir, the man accusing everyone of cheating these days, he does go knight c to e2, but this turns out to be significantly weaker here. What's the problem? Well, Gukesh, he just flies in with the queen to f2, hitting the king d2 is forced, there's no other legal move, and now Gukesh, he jumps in with the knight to e3, hitting the queen on d1. This is just an absurd position out of the opening. I mean, this is what you typically see in like online blitz chess with 1,000, 2,000 rated players, not in GMs over 2,700. All right, now, of course, the queen is under attack. Where is it going to go? Well, in the game, queen to e1 is the move. And now Gukesh finds a brilliant way to simplify to an endgame. He literally only has one good move here. If you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find the one good move for Gukesh right here in this position. All right, the move, of course, it is not knight to g4. That would be a massive mistake. Then after queen takes, knight takes, white would be doing excellent. Instead, the move is knight takes c4, winning the pawn with check. Here's the idea. If you take that knight, d takes c4, then you lose on the spot. For example, d takes c4, then rook d8 hits the king. The king is forced to move off the d file, and after king c2, you just take the undefended queen on e1. So, knight takes c4, the poison knight, you cannot take it. The king must move. Vladimir knows that. King d1 is the move, and now Gukesh just trades the queens. Queen takes, king takes, and then he gets his knight the heck out of there. Knight to b6 is the move, and now get a load of this. In the endgame, with the queens off the board, Gukesh is up a whole pawn in this position, that being the pawn on c4 that Gukesh just won for nothing. Beyond that, Gukesh does have the bishop pair. However, for now, it's not that important as the game is relatively closed. However, if the game ever opens up in the future, those two Bs on c8 and g7 will be a massive asset. All right, this is Gukesh D's game to win. He is ahead in material. Let's see if he can pull it off. Bishop e3 is the move by Vladimir, putting pressure on that weak pawn on c5. But Gukesh, he counterattacks instead of defending. He goes rook d8, putting pressure on that very weak pawn on d3. Now, the point being, if you take the c pawn, black takes the d pawn, and then black's rook on d3 would be tremendously active. So with that in mind here, Vladimir, he does defend the pawn. Rook d1, but the drawback of this sequence, or the benefit of this sequence for Gukesh, now with the rook on d8 instead of f8, the bishop has access to the f8 square. It just goes there, bishop f8, defending that pawn on c5, and now Gukesh, he does maintain his material advantage. All right, Vladimir, knight f3, jumping up with the knight. Then we have knight d5, jumping up with his own knight is Gukesh, and putting pressure on that bishop. Now, the bishop must move sooner or later, but first, rook g1 hits the king, king h7, and then bishop f2. The point being, the bishop is quite active on this diagonal. It is threatening bishop h4, putting pressure on that vulnerable rook on the d8 square. Gukesh knows this. He goes bishop e7, locking down that diagonal. And now here Vladimir, he's got to find a good way to continue. He is down a pawn. He has to find some way to get activity to fight back in the game. Now, what are his options? Technically, you can go bishop h4 right away. The point being, after bishop takes, knight takes, the knight will have access to g6. It's not a bad square. It's not threatening a whole lot, but a decent square for the knight nonetheless. Beyond that, you can go, say, rook c1, king d2, and so on. But in the game, he does go knight to h4 immediately without trading bishops. Very interesting. Now, Gukesh, it turns out the strongest move is actually giving up the bishop pair. Simply bishop takes h4, then bishop takes, and then simply rook to g8, challenging white's dominance of the open g-file. That would be the strongest sequence, and this bishop, it's not really doing a whole lot, and trading those bishops for the knight is a good idea in this exact position. Now, instead, Gukesh does go bishop d7. I don't blame him. I love those two b's myself. I probably wouldn't trade on h4 either. And now here, Vladimir, knight to g6, jumping in with the knight, again, pressuring those b's. All right, now, here, Gukesh, rook to g8, challenging white's dominance of the open g-file. Of course, the idea being, if knight takes e7, then knight takes, regains the piece, and of course, black will be in a position to fight for the g-file. Now, here, Vladimir, knight c3 is the move, putting pressure on that knight on d5, not a bad idea. And it turns out there are a lot of lines in this position where actually going knight takes d5, and then c takes, and then b4 would be strong for white. There are a lot of lines where that is the right sequence. All right, now, rook a to e8 for Gukesh, then king e2, centralizing his king is Vladimir. Now, b6, bolstering that pawn on c5, not a bad move at all. And now it turns out knight takes d5, followed by b4 is actually quite playable for white, believe it or not. Beyond that, rook g3, intending rook d to g1 is also good. Instead, king to f3 is the move, Vladimir marching his king down the board. And now Gukesh, bishop d8, finally getting his bishop to safety. Knight takes d7, or e7, sorry, is no longer a possibility. All right, now, once again, Vladimir, the strongest move, especially here, is knight takes d5, intending c takes, then b4, trying to open up the queen side and making a new line of attack. But instead here, rook g2 is the move, a little bit of a mistake. All right, now we have bishop c8, then rook dg1, and bishop a6, a very interesting rerouting process of the bishop. Now going to a6, challenging that white pawn on d3. How is Vladimir going to defend? Well, he goes king to e2, missing the idea of the intermediate move, knight takes d5, and then king to e2. Now here, Gukesh, the strongest move is simply knight to e7, eliminating the chance for white to take on d5, but instead, bishop c7 is the move, a slightly dubious move. Now Vladimir, bishop h4, and we have bishop d8, then bishop f2, another mistake, and here Gukesh, he finally spots the right idea, knight to e7, jumping back with the knight, putting pressure on that knight on g6, and also eliminating knight takes d5 ideas from white. That is white's main idea in that position, so hats off to Gukesh for finding it. Now we have b4, expanding on the queen side, trying to threaten b takes c5, then bishop takes. Vladimir finally getting some counterplay, but now Gukesh, c4, keeping the queen side closed. The point being, if you take the pawn, then bishop takes, regains it with check, and Gukesh would be doing excellent. All right, now Vladimir, d4, keeping the center closed himself instead, but now we have knight takes, h takes, and very importantly, king to g7, blockading that pawn. All right, now here, Vladimir, the right idea to move forward is rook to h2, intending perhaps rook g to h1, piling up pressure on that weak h-pawn of black. Instead, Vladimir, he starts to go on tilt against the Indian superstar, maybe even the new future world champion. We'll have to wait and see in a few days here. He plays the move b5. And Vladimir, I gotta say, what the heck is this move? You're giving up a pawn for free. There is no reason to play b5, literally at all. Now here, Gukesh, he says, Well, I'm going to take the pawn. Bishop takes b5. And Vladimir, what are you going to do about it? What's your idea? And it turns out Vladimir, he has no idea. If you take the bishop, then c takes b5, regains the piece. And again, black will have that giant, massive queenside pawns just marching down the board. That'll be game over on the spot. So instead, Vladimir, he does go d5. Vladimir continues his march on tilt, giving up a second pawn, seemingly for no reason as well. And Gukesh says, you know what? No problem, Vladimir. E takes d5. I'll take that pawn. Now, Vladimir, turns out he does sort of have an idea here. Bishop d4, try to centralize the bishop. Now, Gukesh says, all right, no problem. Rook e6, king d2, bishop a6 retreating. Now, knight e2, and then finally c5, putting pressure on the bishop. Now, here, Vladimir, to his credit, he finds a brilliant idea. He does not move the bishop. He goes king to e3, allowing Gukesh to take on d4. And believe it or not, I mean, personally, I don't believe it. I don't know how Stockfish finds this. It turns out c takes d4 is not a good move in this position. Then white takes back with the knight. Knight takes d4, and shockingly, that knight is actually very well placed. White does have something of a blockade of these pawns for now. The rook will be pressured, and it turns out white would be doing relatively okay. I got to show you. Look at the eval bar on the left. After c takes, then knight takes. It shoots up. Somehow, this is supposed to be relatively okay for white. I don't get it. That is computer chess for you these days. All right, Gukesh. Rook to f8 is the move. Then we have knight g3 and c takes d4. Finally winning the pawn now that the knight no longer has access to d4. So, Gukesh, excellent. Waiting for knight g3, then taking on d4. All right, king takes d4. Then bishop b7. Gukesh obviously is up 2 pawns in this position. It's his game to win if Vladimir cannot hang on. All right, knight h5 hits the king. Now, very importantly, where should the king go? It turns out all these squares are covered. You only have 2 squares, g8 and h8. If you go to h8, g7 forks the king and the rook. That is game over on the spot. So instead, king g8 is the move, the right move by Gukesh. All right, now g7, pushing the pawn forward yet again. Then rook f to e8 is the move. Now rook g6, flying in with the rook. Vladimir trying to get some sort of counterplay, but Gukesh, he says no problem. Bishop e7, a very curious move, but it has an idea. If you go rook takes d6, or e6, sorry, then bishop c5, hits the king with tempo, and then you do regain the missing piece. Now, instead of that, Vladimir goes knight f6 check, a very cheeky looking move, but Gukesh is not phased. He takes on f6 with the rook. Rook takes f6, the temporary rook sacrifice. Here's the point. After e takes f6, then Gukesh finds the brilliant move, bishop c5, skewering the king and the rook on g1. Oh no, Vladimir, it's not looking good. King c3, then bishop takes g1, and now Vladimir, of course, he has the option of rook takes g1, but that would be game over on the spot. I mean, black has the extra piece, the extra pawns on the queen side. That would be too much. So Vladimir here, his only chance is to try and make these pawns remote. With that in mind, he goes rook takes h6 instead of rook takes g1. But Gukesh, he is on top of things. King f7, then rook h8, hoping for rook takes g6. But here, Gukesh, the last move of the game, simply rook to g8, the blockade. There is no way to push these pawns any further. Of course, Gukesh now, his plan is to use these 2 bishops to escort his queenside pawns down the board. It is game over. So for that reason, right here in this position, Vladimir Kramnik does resign on the spot to Gukesh D. Maybe the future world champion. We'll have to wait and see. All right, Chess YouTube, if you enjoyed this video, smash that like button. Smash it right now. And if you want to see more Gukesh versus Vladimir action, check out this game right here, where again, Gukesh shows Vladimir who the real boss is in that relationship. That game was insane. If you want more Gukesh versus Vladimir action, check that game out, and I'll see you in the next video.